Some theists claim that panentheism simply uses different language to express many qualities already held by theists, and therefore is unworthy to possess its own metaphysical category of being anything other than a dressed-up theism. This could be true to a degree. However, compared to panentheism, theism is indeed particular and partial in its metaphysical views of the whole of reality, and making up perhaps merely half of the panentheistic equation, the other half being that of pantheism. It's been said that pantheism has been combined or married to theism in order for the panentheistic model to be complete, as it derives its views from each by fusing together two very different, and in some cases oppositional, views of the nature of God and the God-world relationship. Perhaps this is where many become confused by saying there is difficulty demarcating them. Panentheism contains elements from each and can indeed be named as another form of theism to a degree, simply because the theistic view is indeed part and parcel of its all-in-all ontological foundation. Without theism or pantheism, panentheism simply wouldn't exist as an alternative. However, it does and is indeed a unique way of seeing the nature of God by unifying two apparently opposing views. It makes for a harmony which would not or could not otherwise exist. So, the claim that panentheism cannot be distinguished from classical theism is perhaps just as presumptive, partial, and short-sighted as a standalone theism claiming no distinction at all. Most theists do not support pantheism of any form. Most pantheists reject most of what classical theism maintains, but uniquely, panentheism supports both views in many ways, yet remains completely distinct, espousing a holism unmatched by any partial alternatives. There indeed is an obvious distinction which becomes quite clear when we compare diagrams of each model side by side. Panentheism is obviously a unique metaphysical hybrid and combines these apparently competitive views of God into one congruent harmony. It could very well be said that it's at least a step closer to a feasible universal philosophy, as was articulated by Daniel J. Shepard in his variation, which he calls symbiotic panentheism. By integrating terms and concepts, panentheism is not a stand-alone theological model, but espouses philosophy as well as science just as much, if not more so, than traditional theism has in its history. In fact, there are indeed many reasons for modern science to reject a strict supernaturalism concerning any hypothesis for the existence of a God. But within panentheism, this need not be the case. In fact, panentheism is far more of an equivalent to being a formulation of process or open and relational theology than its supernaturalist cousin. And further yet, process panentheism as a variation of panentheism is far more in sync with evolutionary science. Whereas in traditional theism, it's created over the years, in its apparent struggle with modern science, a subcategory of creation science, also known as creationism. A category often viewed by most mainstream scientists as being unscientific, to say the least, with their espoused materialist scientism. With this in mind, it's easy to see a clear line of distinguishing these ontological models of the God-world relationship. Panentheism, although more likely to agree with evolutionary sciences, has the capability to accept all which theists maintain, including a supernatural element, without rejecting most tenets of mainstream science. Along with the concept of symbiosis, that being a deeper independence between matter and spirit, God and world, science and theology, and yes, theism and pantheism. The category then of what's called supernature and strict transcendence is fused with pantheism's sacred matter to form a non-dual union between heaven and earth, with its emphasis upon the immanence of God in all creation. With this being said, classical theism is divided and problematically dualistic in its approach of a top-down hierarchical theology. It effectually has created an impossible scenario of deep fragmentation and religious confusion, as most strict theists also promote religious exclusivity, being then that only their own religious tradition is true, while all others are idols or simply false religion. All three of the Abrahamic traditions, along with their strict monotheistic quote-unquote God, have espoused their own brand of exclusivity based upon their own interpretations of who or what God is to them. This poses an insurmountable problem for creating an atmosphere of peace between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Panentheism, however, does not carry this particular burden because, by its very nature, is indeed an interfaith, interreligious, metaphysical theology, and in holding to the doctrine of synthesis, tends to eliminate these confusions, being highly pluralistic, theocentric, universal, and could be very well called a cosmo-theological blueprint for a universal philosophy. Religious exclusivism, be it Christian theism or otherwise, simply does not have the capacity to carry within its partiality and imposed limitations a complete picture of the whole of all reality the ways that panentheism can and does. By clearly making the minor shift in distinction of en or in, that the entire physical universe is actually within God, the causative force, the ultimate, the absolute pure consciousness, mind of God, or whichever one may choose to call him, her, it. A very unique worldview compared to all the others, and why panentheism is clearly distinct in many ways and could very well be dubbed as not solely the scientific theory of everything, but truly a theological, philosophical, and yes, even scientific theory, which, if properly understood, has the capability to reconcile all things into a harmony. So the term itself says everything it claims itself to be, literally all in God. Another distinction between that of the traditional theism model coupled with monotheistic religious rigor with that of the process and or panentheism model is theism tends to be competitive rather than cooperative with other philosophies and global spiritual traditions, focusing mostly upon converting followers from one tradition into another. Panentheism, firstly, as a foundational universal philosophy, does not focus upon conversion from one tradition into another, nor does it require the proselytizing of outsiders or quote-unquote the lost. It simply bypasses the reductions and exclusions which exclusivist thinking promotes within its static creeds and doctrines, and states that all is within God, and no one soul is to be excluded, nor is anything necessarily outside of God, except perhaps within the drama of individual consciousness development, where the agnostic or atheist or even Satanist is unaware of the all-pervading presence of the divine in the world, and to them personally God remains hidden, an illusion, a delusion, because they obviously are not aware or as aware of God's activities as others are that have experienced the divine presence firsthand. I'd say that, given the case, the process of time, coupled with God's grace and infinite mercy, there is still, indeed, yet hope for those who are to see or experience God's activity in our world. Although panentheism does not necessarily require conversion in order to grasp its all-encompassing reaches, it doesn't necessarily require leaving behind or subtracting from what you already believe, or to leave your own foundational tradition. But it does require some math of addition rather than that of exclusion, reductionism, and subtraction of some sort.